Uh, yeah. Welcome all to the lecture about the cartography of the religious landscape of the Baltic provinces in 19th century. I'm very intrigued by the topic. I hope you all are too. And I give the microphone to the Catherine Gibson, who will introduce herself and will give us the whole lecture. After the lecture, I will have small 15-minute question session. During the lecture, please do write your questions in the chat. We will discuss them after the lecture. And yeah, welcome, Catherine. The mic is all yours.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to come and speak to you all today. It's great to see so many of you here, and thank you for joining me to come and hear for the next hour or so some stories about maps and map making in the 19th century Baltic provinces. So I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Tartu. You may hear from my voice that I'm not originally Estonian. I'm originally from the UK, from Scotland, but I've been working here at the university for 3 years. And the research that I'm going to be talking to you today is the result of a longer project I have been working on about the history of cartography in the Baltic provinces of the Russian Empire. And specifically, I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the research that is part of our ongoing project that we have here at the University on Tartu on the history of orthodoxy in Estonia. So I'm going to now share my screen because I have some slides. So hopefully you should now all be able to see my screen okay.
Yeah, exactly. We're all seeing the screen. I will turn my camera off so that not to distract anyone from your slides. And yeah, yeah, here you go.
Perfect. Okay. So each one of us has encountered maps in our daily life. We use Google Maps to find directions, or we may have a sat nav in our car to help us navigate when we drive somewhere. Maps regularly feature in museum exhibits, in history books, on news, on social media, as well as in advertising and in all sorts of different places that we may encounter maps. Notably as well, the National Atlas of Estonia, which was published in 2019, was one of the best-selling non-fiction books in Estonia that year when it was published, which shows just how popular maps continue to be. Part of our fascination with maps comes or is related to how useful we find them. They are packed with information that is presented in an attractive, concise, and easy to read way. They give us a bird's eye view of the world, which we could never hope to obtain ourselves from our vantage point on the ground. They allow us to see phenomena in a big picture and to grasp the lie of the land in ways that we might not be able to understand just from looking at data filled with tables or a data table filled with numbers, or from a page of text or description. So they allow us to see different trends and patterns. However, maps can also be deceptive. They can give us a false impression that they somehow show the world as it really is. And this is particularly the case when we look at modern maps, such as the map that I have here on the screen, which is a map from this National Atlas of Estonia, showing the contemporary religious situation. So maps like this appear to be objective. They appear to be founded on scientific and mathematical principles. However, we must always remember that maps are material and visual objects that are crafted by human hands, or in some cases by software made using software, computer software, which is programmed by people. And that maps are always the product of lots of decisions and choices. The person making the map has to decide what data should be included, as well as what shouldn't be included, and how to strike a balance between including enough detail and including all the information on the map to make it useful and informative, but at the same time to make a map that is still readable, that doesn't become too overwhelming and crammed full of different details. So making a map is actually a highly creative process. It's a process of design. The map maker has to decide how information should be presented and arranged, what kinds of cartographic symbols should be included to communicate the key message to audiences in a clear way. The map maker also has to think, about the kinds of colors that are used and what meanings and different emotions are conveyed by colors. So if we see red on a map, what sort of associations does this give us? And also, how can the same information be presented in different ways and with different results? Many of these questions might be familiar to you. However, they are not new. The history of cartography has a long history, and map makers have been asking these same questions for just about as long. In my talk today, I'm going to introduce you to the history of mapping in our region, in the Baltic region, and specifically Estonia, with a specific focus on how religious issues and different confessional groups and communities have been represented on maps. In my talk today, I'm going to cover the following points. So I'm going to begin by giving a very brief overview of cartography, of maps and map making in the history of the Russian Empire from the late 19th century up to the end of the empire, just before the First World War. I'm going to then zoom in a little bit and look more closely at different approaches to mapping religion in the Baltic provinces of the empire from the 1840s up to the period just after Estonian independence in the early 1920s. Then I'm going to zoom in a little bit more and guide you through the process of how we might actually unravel the story of a single map. So I'm going to be talking in even more depth about one map produced by Alexander Rittich in the 1870s. Then I'm going to wrap up the talk by just giving you some tips on how you might go about working with maps as a historical source if you are interested in local history, or if you work in a museum, for example, and some of the resources that are available to you if you're interested in learning more. And then I will conclude by saying a few words about how we can take some of the things we can learn from these periods of history and apply them to how we think about maps in the present. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of how the history of cartography in the Russian Empire is closely tied to histories of statehood, of governance, and of power. So the history of cartography, especially in the 18th and 19th century, was closely linked to imperial exploration and expansion, as well as the role of science and technology as instruments of state power, control, surveillance, and governance. For Russia's rulers in particular, mastering space was of central importance due to the sheer size and physical location of the landmass under their control, which stretched halfway across the globe. Muscovite map makers, such as the example I have here up on the screen, experimented with different ways of producing maps that gathered information about topography, terrain, natural resources, settlements, different people, even wild animals like the creatures that you see here on the map. And this was very much a way of charting expanding frontiers, as well as extracting duties from population, taxing, and locating potential economic resources. In the early 18th century, during Peter the Great's reign, Western European astronomy, navigation, geodesy, and surveying practices came to be a key part of map making in the Russian Empire. In the second half of the 18th century, Catherine the Great inaugurated the first general land survey to register property boundaries in European Russia. Under Tsar Paul I, at the turn of the 19th century, we see a gradual kind of shift in responsibility which occurred from the Academy of Sciences to the military, with the creation of the Russian Empire's map depot in 1797. And in 1812, Tsar Alexander I established the military topographical depot, which assumed responsibility for producing printed maps and for exercising censorship over cartographic materials. The Baltic provinces were intimately connected to this history of the development of exploration and mapping in the Russian Empire, many of whom, the key figures, were biographically connected in different ways to our region. So we have Friedrich Georg Wilhelm Struve, who was an astronomer and an initiator of the geodetic survey from Finland to the Black Sea. This is part of the map here that you see on the left. We have another famous figure, such as Alexander Middendorf, who was an explorer and scientist. And then people like Karl Ernst von Baer, natural scientist and one of the founding members of the Russian Geographical Society, which was established in 1845 on the model of other similar geographical societies which had been established in other European capitals, and which over the course of the second half of the 19th century would be one of the major actors and map producers in the Russian Empire. And I will be coming to talk a little bit more about the Russian Geographical Society later in my talk as well. Over the course of the second half of the 19th century, we saw the culmination of this shift from mapping being a purvey of just the academicians and explorers within the Academy of Sciences and the Russian Imperial Army, to the gradual permeation of mapmaking into almost every realm of the imperial administration as a tool of scientific and rationalized state planning and policy. So what we see in the Russian Empire actually it's not unique to the Russian Empire. This permeation of maps throughout society was something that was happening all over Europe. But in the Russian Empire in particular, we see, for example, a wide range of uses of maps. So for example, on the top left-hand corner, we have soil mapping. So this was used to determine different types and quality of soil to inform agricultural and economic policy. On the top right, we have a cholera map from Riga in 1817, which showed different cases of cholera throughout the city. So this is an example of maps being used to inform and study public health and the spread of disease. And then at the bottom, we have an excerpt of a map of part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which, as you can imagine, mapping played a very key role in the development of the Russian Empire's railways and other transport and communication infrastructures, such as the telegraph or postal routes. These developments were also taking place in the Russian Empire's Baltic provinces, which is the region that we're going to be concentrating on today. The 19th century witnessed the birth of the modern obsession with different forms of data visualization, statistical maps, and different kinds of infographics as a way to understand modern society. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about religion, which is the focus of this talk and this mini series of lectures in collaboration with the University of Tartu. And I want us to look closer at how maps have been used to examine different issues related to religion in the Baltic. So, while the location of different churches, for example, on maps, was a common feature of maps in the 18th century, sometimes even earlier in the 17th century, when the Baltic provinces were ruled by Sweden. When we think about the history of religious cartography in the Baltic, the 1840s are a real watershed moment, because it was only after this period that religion came to be perceived as a topic worthy of mapping in its own right. So rather than just having topographic maps with different churches marked on it, we see the rise of maps specifically made about different religious issues. So this is what I'm going to be concentrating on. So you might ask, what happened in the 1840s? Well, in the second half of the 1840s, more than 100,000 Lutheran peasants in Livland province voluntarily converted to Orthodoxy. This mass conversion movement left a long-lasting mark on the religious landscape of the Baltic provinces in the decades that would follow. Where previously the Orthodox presence had been quite weak, as the region had been predominantly Lutheran, thereafter the region came to be perceived by the Orthodox Church and Russian imperial authorities as part of the western borderlands of the Orthodox faith. And we see this in 1850, when as one of the consequences of this mass conversion, an independent diocese of Riga and Mitau, so today's Jelgava in Latvia, was established, and Bishop Platon was appointed. In the years that followed the creation of the diocese of Riga and Mitau, the poor Orthodox infrastructure in the Baltic provinces left the church struggling to administer to all its new parishioners. So basically, it struggled to have enough capacity. It struggled due to the limited number of church buildings and the number of priests, especially those that had knowledge of local languages, such as Estonian and Latvian. And this meant that the Orthodox Church's coverage in the region remained patchy and overstretched. So this problem, and actually this is a key theme in general in the history of cartography, that maps are often made to help solve problems. And this is a good example of this. So the kind of struggling infrastructure of the Orthodox Church prompted a wave of different maps to help assess the issue, assess the deficiencies, and to help inform and direct policy about how the situation could be improved. So as a result, we see different kinds of maps appearing in the second half of the 19th century to address some of these problems. So on the left, we have a map of Livland province mainly, but also showing Courland and Estland to the north as well, showing Orthodox primary schools in the Baltic provinces. And this was used to kind of inform policy about where churches were located, where resources were needed, and to also make suggestions about where future churches and investment in education was needed. On the right, we have an example of another map, which shows the location of Orthodox churches. So again, we have this similar kind of use of cartography to survey the religious landscape of the region, to provide an overview of all the different parishes, and again to help inform policy about how to address this problem of their of the limited and overstretched infrastructure. In many ways, these maps came too late because the new converts quickly experienced a mounting dissatisfaction with orthodoxy, heightened by their realization that they had been misled by rumors. They became disillusioned when the material benefits they had been promised for converting to the so-called Tsar's faith of orthodoxy didn't materialize. And they became discouraged when they were discriminated against by their Lutheran landlords. And actually already by the 1850s, 1860s, the tide had turned and many converts began, in fact, to return to Lutheranism. Strictly speaking, this was illegal, as reverting to orthodoxy from a former faith was not allowed under imperial law before the 1905 Edict of Toleration. However, the Baltic provinces had a special status, we could say, because in 1865, the Tsarist authorities had decided to overlook the enforcement of laws in both Estland and Courland that required couples in mixed marriages to make a premarital pledge to baptize and raise their children as Orthodox. And basically, some parents took this non-enforcement of the law as to mean that they had permission to raise their children as Lutherans. And others went further still and saw this move as a relaxation of the laws prohibiting return to Lutheranism. So as a result, the number of mixed marriages, multi-faith families, and people that chose to convert back to Lutheranism increased. At the same time, there was a reversal again in 1881, following the accession of Tsar Alexander III, when these policies were rolled back, and Lutheran pastors who had administered to apostates, so people that had formerly orthodoxy and then left and either converted or returned to Lutheranism, were persecuted. And this shift in policy also coincided with changes instigated by the imperial government and a range of different policies that were initiated or implemented to more closely integrate the Baltic provinces with the rest of the Russian Empire. And some of these will probably be familiar to you as well, such as the switch to Russian language as the language of administration and education. And some of these policies are often referred to as Russification policies. But if we look at religion, this period also prompted several further waves of conversion to Orthodoxy in Livland, in Courland, and also notably in northwest Estland. So the picture that I have just painted for you is one that is quite messy and complicated. It's a story of people that converted, sometimes reconverted or lapsed due to the changing legal status and shifts in imperial policy. Again, this created another problem. And again, cartography was used to help try and provide a solution, or at least to help find an answer. So in the late 1880s, the Provincial Statistical Committee experimented with a novel approach to try and understand what was happening. The Statistical Committee in Livland gathered data on the number of Lutherans, Orthodox, and what they termed as evaders from Orthodoxy in each parish, and visualized this data on a series of statistical maps. And these maps are held in the National Archives of Estonia in Tartu. And as far as we can establish, these are a really unique example in the context of the Russian Empire of how imperial authorities and local government were exploring new methods for visualizing statistical data to understand bigger patterns and trends in religious commitment. And I've discussed these also with colleagues, and this is, as far as we know, the only known examples of attempts to map conversion. So not fixed religious communities, but the idea that people could move between different religious groups. And so they serve for us as well as really important sources for understanding the gulf which often existed between official practices of documenting religious identities, such as in church books, and the realities of everyday lived religious experiences in the past, which were often much more fluid. And if we also compare this map with the previous examples of maps that I showed you on the former slide, we also see another important shift. So whereas on these maps, the whole purpose or idea behind mapping, we can say, was to convey information about location. So the location of schools, the location of churches. By the late 1880s, we have an understanding of mapping as being about the visualization of statistical data on a certain topic. So this doesn't so much tell us about the location of these lapsed Orthodox, but rather it is about percentages, it's about proportions, and instead we get this image of a kind of shifting landscape of religious commitment and loyalties. In 1897, the Russian imperial government conducted its first full census of the whole of the Russian Empire. This was a monumental event that involved many years of logistical planning. And in the years following the census, various attempts were made by statisticians to publish data visualizations to display, analyze, and communicate the census findings. So, for example, one of the most colorful and popular publications produced and widely circulated was this statistical atlas of Russia, published by the famous geographical publisher A.F. Marx in 1907. And if we look at how the data on religion was displayed, we see over on the left-hand side 2 colorful pie charts, as well as bar charts, which highlighted some interesting trends. So on the one hand, the pie charts would lead us to believe that the number of Orthodox in the empire had increased from approximately 60 million in 1870 to 87 million by 1897, the date of the census. However, we also can see interesting change in that the actual percentage of Orthodox dropped from around 72.3% to 69.5%. And this raised the interesting question, which was not specifically addressed by Marx in his geographical statistical atlas of Russia, but forms part of the kind of subtext behind the work. And this decrease in the proportion, but increase in overall numbers of Orthodox in the empire was likely due to the incorporation of Central Asia and the rising proportion of Muslims, which we also see in blue on the 2 pie charts. So this also raises the interesting question about what is said and what is not said in terms of how the data is visualized and what explanations are given for the various numbers and figures. In another example of maps or different cartograms, as they were called, visualizing data on religion from the same 1897 census. A series of different, these quite stylized cartograms were produced to visualize the percentage of different religious groups in different provinces of the western part of the empire, so-called European Russia. And again, this not much explanation was given within the publication about the various meanings kind of behind the decision to visualize data in this way. But commentators who engaged and read these seemingly kind of objective reports on the census saw other meanings in it too. So, for example, the map that you see on the left shows the percentage of Protestants within the empire, and there you see quite clearly that the Baltic provinces of Estland, Livland, Courland in the top left-hand corner have the highest density of this group, and this was used to make kind of arguments about this region being somehow anomalous, within the empire, and a potential region requiring policy interventions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in another example later. And then on the other hand, on the right-hand side, we have what is actually quite a rare map showing the percentage of old believers in the different provinces. And what makes this map quite unusual is that it was very rare for Old Believers to be mapped as a separate category. Often they were included together with Orthodox. And this was quite a rare attempt to actually make this population visible in the religious landscape of the region in and of its own right. So these different approaches and projects to map different religious minorities also raise important questions about the purpose or the potential purpose behind these different projects, and questions of surveillance and gathering data on minorities, and also, in the case of Old Believers, populations that were considered to be religious dissidents. Following the Estonian Declaration of Independence in 1918, the new Estonian government also carried out censuses and published statistical atlases to report on their results. So here we see in many ways one aspect of the continuities between the imperial period and also the period of independent Estonian statehood, about the need to gather information about populations and present it and visualize it for the world in cartographic form. In the case of the Estonian example here, the conduct of the first state census was presented as an important achievement and source of national pride for the new republic. The atlases also had an important international orientation. Note how the language is in Estonian and also French. So this atlas was as much for the international community, for diplomats, for different contacts abroad, as it was for the Estonian domestic audience. And the maps in the atlas were intended to demonstrate that Estonia deserved a place in New Europe. In addition to thematic maps showing Estonia's physical geography, economic resources, the atlas also included a map of religion. And in addition, you also see a map here of nationalities as well. So there was also information about the Estonian population. And what is quite striking, if we look at this representation of religion in Estonia compared to the maps produced in the imperial period, we see how there's again this a real emphasis on the sizable kind of Lutheran population, but then also highlighting various other minority faiths and in some cases majority faiths, such as in Petseri, where you have an overwhelming Orthodox majority. So far, all the maps that I have shown you are what we can call top-down mapping projects. They are maps that were produced and funded and published, distributed by state, church, or local government authorities, who used mapping as a tool to gather knowledge about populations, in this case, different religious populations, to address and help inform what they saw as important social issues or pressing problems of the day, or to project a certain image of the region to the outside world. However, cartography and other forms of statistical data visualization were also developing in other directions too during this period. And we can see that there was also several what we can think of as more kind of bottom-up trends. which were occurring as well. So notably, in the 1860s and up to 1881, the provincial statistical committees in the Baltic provinces of Estland, Livland, and Courland carried out a series of local censuses to count the population and collect data on various aspects of society. In many ways, these were truly groundbreaking, not least because they actually asked local populations themselves to provide information about their personal details. So rather than taking information from church books or other existing administrative documents, or as was the case during the 1897 census, to employ people to go and speak to heads of households and as counters, and to kind of gather information that way. During these Baltic censuses organized by the local statistical committees, the census organizers asked each individual to report on information such as their name, religion, language, marital status, etc. And you can see an example, a kind of template of these kinds of forms that were used and circulated on the right. And you can see there was a question about religion, number 5, where the respondent had to underline or circle or mark the paper in some way to indicate themselves what their faith was. And quite unusual and unique for the time was the option to indicate another faith. So if you self-identified as being from a religious community that was not one of the pre-printed options on the form, and you were able to write, then you were free to also write for yourself another option. One of these such censuses that was carried out in Revel, so present-day Tallinn, on the 16th of November 1871, did just this. So Paul Edward Jordan, who was the head of the Estland Provincial Statistical Committee, was in charge of coordinating this census. And later, as part of his publication of the results of the census, he published a series of data visualizations which provide a unique snapshot of life in the provincial capital. Jordan visualized data on religion in the following stacked bar chart, which showed the religious composition of the populations of the city's various districts. And this was based on the kinds of forms that I just showed you on the previous slide. So we see that the blue color refers to evangelicals, what Jordan meant by Protestants. We also have Catholics in orange, and he said, well, Greek Catholic, and by this he means Orthodox, what we would today call Orthodox. We also have Roman Catholics in gray, Jews in brown, and Muslims in yellow, living in different quarters of the city. So this innovative form of visualizing data on the province's of capital enabled kind of comparison across different districts. And notably, you might see that the first district, which is on the far right-hand side, which is today's Kalamaja region of Tallinn, was the most religiously diverse. And actually we see it was home to a large proportion of non-Lutherans, so of Orthodox, of Roman Catholics, and also Muslims. And this district of the city in the 19th century was primarily industrial, located next to the port and the Pattaya sea fortress, used at the time as a military barracks. So many of the workers, sailors, merchants, soldiers living in this part of the city had moved to the Baltic provinces from other parts of the empire, thereby contributing to the multiconfessional character of this district of the city. However, Jordan was also very conscious of the fact that the bar chart's neatly stacked columns only told part of the story. And here on my next slide, I put up quite a long quote, but I think that it's really illuminating and shows us the gap which existed between the neat bar charts and the kind of messiness of the data collected at the street level, so to speak. So I will read it out. So this is from Jordan's report. And he noted how, in general, confession was often mixed up with nationality, so that it is not uncommon for people who, like everyone in their immediate vicinity, are ethnically Estonians, spoke German, and were in name and by ancestry Estonian, were counted as Russians because of their Greek, means Orthodox confession, or were counted so by others. And so it happened, for example, that in one and the same family, one Greek Orthodox child was referred to as of Russian nationality and the other Lutheran as of Estonian nationality. So he was pointing to the gap and discrepancy which existed between the categories that were printed on the forms, the data that were used to collect data, and how people understood these questions and what they wrote down and answered. So Jordan's reflections about the reliability of data and these pressing methodological questions about how to gather data about people's personal lives and personal information on topics such as religion show us the importance of not taking these maps and different forms of data visualization at face value. It's not enough just to look at maps as a source of information or visualization of data, but to fully understand a map, we need to think about the wider context of its production and its reception. So when I, as a historian of cartography, come across a new map, these are some of the questions that immediately pop into my head. I'm curious about who made the map, why was it made, who paid for it, who financed the project to make the map, because in the periods that we've been looking at, making a map was an incredibly expensive and complex endeavor. I'm interested in how was it made. Then we come to issues of audience and reception. Who looked at it? Did anyone read it? And what did they think of it? And then finally, the question of what is on the map and what is not, and what factors might have determined what was on the map and not. So asking these questions, I would argue, allows us to tell more complex stories about the maps. It allows us to go beyond the surface, just looking at the content, what the map shows us, and to actually understand maps as objects of material and visual culture that were produced in a particular point in time in history. And to illustrate this, I want to tell you the story of a map. And as ever, it's only going to be a partial story because sometimes it's actually very difficult to find answers to all of these questions about a map. But I'm going to try, and let's see how far we get. So the map that we're going to try and tell the story of is a map of religion in the Baltic provinces, which was published by Alexander Fedorovich Retich in 1873. And a copy of this map is held in the National Library of Estonia, and it has been digitized. So if you go on to digar.ee, and you can search for it and you can explore it for yourself. So my first question, who was the map maker? So Retich was actually one of the giants of cartography, of thematic mapping in the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century, and he still has this reputation today. If you look into histories of cartography, Ritich's name will feature there prominently. He was the son of a doctor from Riga. He was educated in St. Petersburg at the Engineering Academy of the General Staff. And as a young engineer, early in his career, he worked in Minsk province to help oversee the construction and repair of Orthodox churches and schools. And later he served in Kazan and in the Balkans and Caucasus during the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877 to 8. He was also a huge fan of maps. Over the course of his career, he published various maps of different multi-ethnic and multi-confessional regions of the Russian Empire. He was also an ardent advocate of the ideology of Pan-Slavism and used his maps to promote the idea of many of these ethnically non-Russian regions of the Russian Empire. And he used maps to make arguments for why they should be seen as part of a wider Russian linguistic and cultural territory. In 1872, Rittig presented a proposal to the Russian Geographical Society in St. Petersburg, which you remember I talked about near the beginning of my talk, of which he was also a member, because he wanted to produce an ethnographic and religious map of the Baltic provinces. The 1870s was a time when there was increasing concern in the Russian press about the so-called Baltic question, which was a whole kind of series of debates which took place, debating the degree of autonomy of the Baltic provinces in the Russian Empire over matters such as local government, language, also the role of the Lutheran the faith, the special status in that region, as well as the manorial economy system of the estates, which were controlled by the Baltic Germans, and which by some intellectuals in Russia came to view this as backward and in need of reform and greater intervention from the imperial government. So against the backdrop of these debates in the press about the Baltic provinces being a crucial kind of region of interest within the empire, Rittig managed to convince the Russian Geographical Society of the relevance and importance of his project, and thus he was able to secure a grant of 300 rubles to finance his project. Rittig quite remarkably managed to publish his maps within 6 months. And the remarkable speed between the date that he was given the money from the Russian Geographical Society and the time at which his maps were published gives us a bit of a hint as historians about some of his approaches to map making. And as we shall see, he perhaps didn't follow the most rigorous research processes or cartographic methods. Sorry, this is a map I meant to show you earlier of one of Rittig's previous cartographic endeavors, showing a map of the Slavic nation or nationality, and this was very much his preferred kind of genre of map making. However, returning to the map that I'm telling the story of, as Estonian historical geographer Taavi Päi has pointed out, Rittich was far from neutral, and his representation of religion in the Baltic provinces was in many ways one that was heavily Russified. So here is a zoomed in version of the map so that you can hopefully see a bit better. So the green color that you see dotted all over the map represents Orthodox communities. And he was able to kind of create such a visually impressive spread of orthodoxy in the region by shading in a kind of whole area inhabited by different Orthodox communities, even when these communities might have been mixed. So there might have been Lutherans and Orthodox together. You'll also note how he shades Old Believers, again, as part of the same color. So this was another strategy to try and make the Orthodox presence appear even greater than it perhaps was. By contrast, I don't know if any of you can actually see where Lutherans are. In fact, they are shaded in a very light pale green, which almost appears to retreat into the background of the map. It makes Lutherans appear almost as if they are the forests or the fields on the map. So our attention passes them by. We almost don't notice them unless we are looking very, very closely. And also, you may notice the very bright, alarming red used to depict Roman Catholics in the region, not so prominent in Estland and Livland, but particularly noticeable in the left-hand image of Courland province. And this is likely no accident and was a response to the anti-Polish and anti-Catholic stance of many elites following the Polish-Lithuanian uprising a decade earlier. So as much this map was also a kind of warning in threatening bright red about potential Polish Catholic influence in Courland as well. The members of the Russian Geographical Society highly praised Rittich's study. They viewed it as an important scientific contribution to ethnographic knowledge about the Baltic provinces in the Russian language. However, not all Rittich's readers were as convinced. And his maps in particular proved highly controversial for the local German-speaking readership in the Baltic. And in particular, the newspaper Rigascher Zeitung ran a lengthy front page review over 3 days condemning Rittich's publication, criticizing the sloppy methods that he used for missing data, for basically inventing a bunch of figures, and criticized the work in the harshest terms. But then the debate didn't stop there, and several days later, another article appeared in the same newspaper defending Rittich, claiming that he was brilliant, and the reason why he had presented such a different image of the Baltic provinces and the kind of religious landscape was precisely because he was a neutral outside observer. So we see here how maps are never just about what they show, but there can be whole other stories and context and subtext around them. And I hope that this kind of story that I've attempted to tell here about Rittich's map can help you see how looking at maps can tell us so much more than just about the map itself. Now I'm just going to very briefly give you a couple of tips if you're interested in learning more about maps, using maps yourself for your own research or just general interests, some resources. So there are actually many maps stored in different archives, especially in Estonia, also in Latvia. But there are also a lot of digital resources that you can use as well. So I will just briefly go through. So notably Digar, which is the digital library of the National Library of Estonia. If you look on their cartographic section, you can see that they have digitized several hundred different maps, and they're all in high resolution. So I encourage you to go there to explore further. There is also the National Archives website have a specific section on maps. And the advantage with this system is that you can search by place. So if you're interested to look for a map of a specific place, you can do that. And then two other international sites, which aren't specifically focused on Estonia, but do have a lot of digitized maps of our region. The first one is the David Rumsey Map Center, which is based out of Stanford University, but they have a huge digital collection of different maps from all over the world. And then the other one is the website lithuanianmaps.com, which is run by a private individual, but it has a huge library of different maps, covering a lot of maps of the Russian Empire as well, topographic maps, all sorts of different kind of maps, and not just Lithuania. And so if you're interested, I recommend that you go and check those out. And if you are interested in reading a bit more about maps and cartography, I recommend that you go and look at the magnificent Estonian National Atlas Eesti Atlas. And there is a whole chapter there specifically on religion and cartography. I've also published a couple of things myself. One is a short blog post, which talks a little bit more about the different maps of conversions that I showed as part of this presentation, which you can find on the blog of the National Archives. And then I have also published a book about the history of cartography in the Baltic provinces. It came out just last month. It doesn't just focus on religion, it's about cartography in general, but it should be available in several libraries in Estonia in the near future, I hope. It's if the postage isn't held up. So just a concluding word that I hope this talk has shown you and encourage you to think about some of the different ways we can look at maps, both as historical objects of material and visual culture. And my aim today has been to introduce you to the long and often fraught history of what is a seemingly familiar object that continues to occupy a prominent place in our lives today. So moving forward, I encourage you to ask questions about maps, not just to look at them as sources of information. When you see a map in a museum, or for example, when you open a book like this about kind of a topic in Estonian history, and you see a map, ask questions. Who made the map? Why did they make the map? What might the intentions be? And I think crucially, what is on the map and what might have been intentionally or not omitted. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm actually very intrigued, and I have a lot of questions, but I don't see any of our listeners have asked in the chat anything, but I hope that I encourage you to ask Catherine any questions you have, and maybe if you're hesitant of asking in English, you still can write any questions you have in Estonian or Russian, and we'll try to translate together with Catherine as best as we can. And Catherine will answer as best as she can. So you still have an opportunity to do that in the next 10, 15 minutes. But in the meanwhile, because there are no questions currently in the chat, I'll ask my burning questions. So about Riti, I think his approaches would be like very celebrated in today's Russia as well, it seems to me. But do you find that cartography in Russia of 19th century was somehow innovative in representing the information, or were Russian cartographers just following the already existing trends? Because of course there had been several empires at the time, and I believe that a lot of them wanted to misrepresent the cultural situation there. So yeah, please comment.
Thank you, Yaroslavna. That's a really great question, and I think, as I hope I kind of conveyed in my presentation, the history of cartography, at least in the 19th century, is intimately tied to histories of empire and governance and statehood. But also, if we look at the institutions that were funding map making as well, and but I think what partly got me so interested in this topic is often we have this narrative when we think about history of science, history of cartography as well, of the Russian Empire somehow always catching up or trying to copy developments that were happening, for example, in the Habsburg Empire or in Prussia. And actually, the more I got into this topic, the more I realized that that there was much more kind of give and take. So I can give kind of two examples of this. The first one was that this development of censuses, for example, that I talked about, and in many ways, Russia is seen in European history as being very late coming to the census. The first full census of the Russian Empire only happened right at the end of the 19th century in 1897, and so fits into this classic narrative of Russia somehow being behind and having to catch up. At the same time, if we look at the local level, at the regional level, and look at these censuses that were happening in the Baltic provinces already in the 1860s, we see a rather different picture of innovation, of experimentation. And actually, after Prussia, the Baltic provinces were the first to use this individual house card counting, where they gave forms to individuals to report their data. So actually, in this context, the Baltic provinces within the Russian Empire were really one of the kind of pioneers and early adopters. We also see a different way of kind of challenging this narrative also among cartographers and members of the Geographical Society. And there was lots of discussions over the course of the second half of the 19th century about how best to map, and especially about how to develop international standards for mapping and collecting data, so that comparisons could be made between, for example, criminal statistics in Russia and in the Habsburg Empire. And we see the same also in cartography. And quite significantly, the International Congress of Statistics came to St. Petersburg. It was hosted by St. Petersburg in 1872. And there we actually have quite interesting discussions also about, because it was held in Russia, the vast majority of the participants were from the Russian Empire. But there we really see, a lot of discussions about how to move the field forward. And Russian cartography was held in quite high regard internationally, and often the kind of narrative that was repeated was actually because Russia is so big, it has almost every type of climate, every all of these conditions, all of these different people. You can really be very kind of experimental and forward thinking in many ways. So as is often the case, if you ask a historian, the question is, it's complicated. It can be yes and no, but I think my main kind of answer would be that it very much depends on where we look in the Russian Empire. And certainly if we look at the Baltic provinces in our region, it really emerges as a real space of kind of innovation. And this might have partly been also because of the high knowledge of German, for example, among elites, among scholars, among academicians at Dorpat, at Tartu University. So they were actually well aware of what was happening in Central Europe and also in St. Petersburg. So they almost had the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and so I just know the story about the Struve measurements and how it was kind of innovative of a project at the time. So it's kind of very interesting. So we have our first question. I hope first and not the last one. In the chat from Bradley Woodworth, did von Baer and Retich know each other in Petersburg? What record is there of their interaction if they did work together?
Thank you, Brad. That's another really great question. And the answer is, I don't actually know. I didn't actually find any evidence of them really interacting. And I think part of it might have been generational, because Rittich was really more active in St. Petersburg in 60s, 70s, 80s. And he certainly joined the Geographical Society after von Baer left. The kind of issue there is that while Karl Ernst von Baer is a very kind of well-known, well-documented figure. Here in Tartu, we have Erkki Tammeksaar, who's really an expert on von Baer. Rittich is a bit of an enigmatic figure, much more. So it may be that there are more kind of biographical information about him, but he becomes a bit of a mystery because he's quite well known, like in the 70s and in the 80s, and then by the 80s he tends to go a bit rogue, I like to think of it, and he starts publishing all his works outside of the Russian Empire. They become a bit extreme, and then his last maps, which are published in the early kind of 1900s, really have very little reception history. So I would love to kind of learn more, but I think it's the sort of story that would need to be told through kind of archival documents, personal documents, if they exist. And so far I haven't been able to hunt them down, but if you know more, I'd be really interested.
Yes, unfortunately, thank you for the answer. And for the interesting question. But I really encourage you to type out your questions in the chat, and we're not actually allowing participants to comment by voice. It's not our format. The discussion is not really what we're planned for. But if you have maybe a longer question, try maybe to phrase it in write it down. I'll voice it. So everyone who has their hands up right now, I am so sorry. So yeah, until we're waiting for the next questions, maybe I can ask another one of mine, if you're not against, but okay. So I know that in 19th century, the Orthodox Church sort of had several sects, and I know that at least a couple of them were sort of secret sects, I think. So I know there had been some some approaches to sort of ask the members of the sect about their religion, but of course I don't think that they participated in the census. I don't think they believed that the census was anything good. So do you know about any studies of the time, or any approaches to number, at least give the number to those members of those sects, or anything like that?
Mm. No, thank you. It's a good question, and I think it raises kind of bigger issues about historical visibility and who we have historical traces of, and who we don't, who made it into official statistics, and even more so onto maps, and who didn't. And I think these are kind of crucial questions whenever we're looking at any population map that we need to ask ourselves. And it doesn't surprise me that these kind of orthodox sects or dissident groups didn't want to kind of participate in these official forms of registration and documentation. And actually, they were not the only ones. We have actually quite a lot of records of people that protested being counted. In 1881, there was two quite famous or well-documented, well-reported protests against this. One was in today's Rakvere region, and the other one was in Ilukske in Courland province. In the case of Rakvere region, there it was out of kind of deep mistrust for about why the census was being carried out, about who these kind of these people that were appointed to hand out the papers. People didn't want to, were asked to show their passports to check if they gave the right name, etc. So there was a lot of and actually quite violent opposition. In the case of Courland, there was a lot of the opposition actually came from Old Believers and other kind of dissident groups who had quite a long tradition of mistrust in these kinds of, and quite rightly, kind of state, or they perceived as these kind of state interventions, and they were worried about being taxed more, or about being resettled to another part of the Russian Empire. So this has a long history, and as historians we need to be kind of aware of who we have records of and who we don't. What we do have in terms of sources about some of these more socially marginalized groups, often they appear in ethnographic accounts. In the 19th century, there was lots of these kind of ethnographic expeditions organized also in the Baltic provinces to various regions, and there often they are more qualitative in nature, so we don't often get actual numbers, but if we are looking to kind of study and understand and get the voices of these people, we can look to those sources for that.
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe the same for not only for the different sects, but also for the different nationalities, smaller nationalities of Russian Empire. So yeah, it's such a pity that they're all sort of omitted from those descriptions. I would love to have the data. We have another question from Richard Tamme. He says, great talk. What is known about censorship or deliberate omissions of strategically sensitive locations in cartography in the Russian Empire? As in Soviet period, closed cities of strategic importance, for example, Silameh, were not included on maps. So are there any examples?
Yes, I think in some ways the Soviet period is quite well known, and I encourage you all also, if you're interested in this kind of subversive cartography and censorship, to also check out the national atlas that I mentioned of Estonia, because there Taavipäe included lots of really kind of interesting examples of this, of, for example, also secret messages that were somehow incorporated onto maps that only the cartographer and several geographers knew about, and things like this. When we talk about censorship in the Russian imperial period, it's a little more complex. And we need here to make the distinction between topographic maps and other sorts of mapping. So when it came to topographic maps, in the very early 19th century, these were subject to quite strict censorship, and all cartography was under the monopoly of the military cartographic depot. So they were based in St. Petersburg, and they were basically a kind of, they were the only one that had the right to print maps, and were also in control of their circulation. But then we actually see that towards the middle of the 19th century, the situation changes, and they actually, maps became much more readily available. They first have to go through this pre-publication censorship, as with all publications in the Russian Empire at that time. But actually, I think it's maybe in the 40s, I might not be correct, right. But yes, they actually open up a shop on Nevsky Prospect called the Geografichesky Magazine, and there they actually sell printed copies of these topographical maps. So they're available for a cost. When we come instead to non-kind of topographical maps. So many of the maps that I showed today in my presentation were not these big kind of military scale topographical maps, but were much kind of smaller maps, often folded inside books or appended to journals or other kinds of publications. And those we find don't go through the military topographic depot. Those just go through the general censorship. And so actually they are quite widely available, and very many of the maps and things that I showed today are available in many libraries across the world. They circulated quite widely. If there were more sensitive topics, then we actually see a difference between maps that were produced in manuscript form, so kind of hand-drawn maps produced, for example, in one copy or in just several copies, and these were quite different from print maps that were much more widely circulated. So when we talk about manuscript maps, these can be maps made by a particular kind of organization. So for example, these maps of the conversions from Orthodoxy, these were hand colored. They'd taken a printed map and made them by hand coloring the information on, and these would not have been publicly available. These were kind of held in local government archives, and quite understandably, they didn't want this kind of information about conversions circulating publicly. So we always have to ask, what form was the map in? Is it just a manuscript that has been hand-drawn in some way? Is it printed? And how widely did it circulate?
But I mean, I think it's not quite so obvious for for me, for example, for a usual person, what was considered sensitive information in the Russian Empire, because we know in Soviet Union there had been like secret towns, military objects that were completely off the maps, but also some just regular towns and regular maps of Soviet Union would have been changed deliberately for I don't know, for distribution abroad. So do you know what was sensitive for in the Russian Empire times?
Well, I think actually, I mean, in most of the maps that I have looked at, there wasn't so much I mean, sensitive information might have been about, you know, certain kind of big kind of social or minority issues. But actually, in many ways in the Russian Empire, it's much harder to keep information secret than it is to make it open. You know,
Oh,
or in
really?
terms of information kind of
I would think it was really
circulating.
hard to dissipate the information, and like maps were not very much available to the majority of the people. So maybe there
At the
was.
same time, when you have this very decentralized
Mhm.
system, so you have these maps being made all over the place,
Uh-huh.
being made by local individuals, you know, there might be some local nobleman that decides to make a map and finance it, some learned society. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's a kind of complicated
Interesting.
question, but I think in this kind of concept of like state secrets and
Mhm.
military security when it comes to cartography is much more prominent in the Soviet
In
period.
later times. Yeah. So I don't see any new questions popping up in the chart in the chat. So I have one last question for you, and maybe it's a personal one. You don't have to answer. I just want to know if you have like a personally favorite type of a map, or a map projection, or type of a diagram or a cartogram. So yeah.
So yes, well, I wrote my book that has just come out focuses on ethnographic maps. So
Mhm.
I would say that for a long time, I'm not sure if they were my favorite, but they were the one that intrigued me the most. And then I think, as I showed today, you know, with lots of these religious maps, when we talk about also these ethnic maps, they become incredibly politicized. And for me, it's really interesting to actually uncover the stories behind them, so that we don't just take, you know, something at face value, but actually understand who made it, why did they make it, why have they endured such enduring popularity in some ways. I mean, especially now on social media, it's quite
Yeah.
common to see some historical maps appear, and
As evidence of
yeah,
something. Yeah.
as some sort of historical source. And so it's really important to be kind of critical and actually understand what this map meant in the 19th century when it was produced, and then what it means, or how it is being used also today.
Do you know of any, one last question, I'm sorry. So do you know of any examples of maps being made by like a small nationality, like small maps of their own, I don't know, as maybe of Far East of Russia, or maybe of local Finno-Ugric people? Yeah, do you know something about
So yeah, it was quite common, for example, among some of these ethnographers and kind of explorers that went to Siberia, especially in the early 19th century and also early Soviet period, to employ locals as guides. And so there has been some really interesting research projects done about kind of indigenous people drawing these hand-drawn maps. And then they were used, especially during the kind of 1920s, during the early Soviet period, and to inform on the work of early Soviet ethnographers. So there's been some really interesting research done there. And then if we also look, for example, at the Baltic, in my book, I have one chapter about maps that were used and sent with petitions. So we actually, and this is something that turns out to be quite a widespread phenomena, that, I mean, petitions, as we all know, was quite a common way for local people to engage with authorities, to make them aware of their problems, to ask for things, to advocate for their grievances. But we also find it was quite common to also enclose small hand-drawn maps to also make kind of visual arguments about land disputes or territories, this kind of thing. So if you're interested to learn more, you can check out, it's the final chapter of my book, has some examples of those.
I really hope it comes soon to at least Tartu University Library. I really want to check it out. It is a fascinating topic. I have never personally thought about maps being like something, something very not objective. So yeah, your talk really inspired me to review my previous convictions, and it is a very true and interesting topic. Yeah, we have to be critical. So yeah, I think we should not keep you any longer. There are no questions in the chat. Thank you all so much, our dear listeners, for listening. Thank you, Catherine. I hope we'll get your book soon. Yeah, everyone, please check out the book whenever you can get it. And I hope you will be able to visit and participate in the next lecture of the cycle. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you once again, Catherine. And have a great Easter weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and to you all for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, for me too. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.